Well, the silent majority never existed, and it was always a ludicrous concept. If it's silent, then it doesn't matter whether it's majority or not anyway. But I think what the use of the phrase silent majority was common in the period when the people whose opinions and morals were about to be overthrown didn't realize that this was about to happen, and were puzzled by the way in which the other side seemed to dominate everything, but they believed that they were still in the majority when they probably weren't. Well, they're very much like people who live in a house which is being eaten by termites, and until the last minute it still looks like a house, and then the termites eventually get the upper hand, and the house collapses in a heap of dust, which is what happened to Christian Europe.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. We're the channel that asks you to think more and follow less, and I'm sure we're going to have plenty to think about in today's discussion. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the columnist Peter Hitchens. Hello Peter, how are you doing?
So far, so good.
Excellent. Now Peter, before we get on to coronavirus, which, and by the way, on coronavirus, I owe you a massive apology, because during that first lockdown, when you were sort of beating the drum, which must have felt like a very lonely episode of drum beating, I thought, oh, okay, Hitchens is crackers here. Hitchens is way off the mark. But you were absolutely right on everything that you said. But we'll get on to that shortly.
Sorry about that, but you're right. I was absolutely right. Yep.
You were. Now, I wonder if we might discuss a couple of items that came out last week that I thought I'd really like to get your thoughts on. The drug deaths in Scotland being one of them, hitting their worst level on record, showing that in 2019, 1,264 people died from drugs misuse, which is more a 6% rise on 2018. Now, the Scottish Government have said that they've set up a drugs task force, and whilst there's been significant scrutiny of the problem, it doesn't seem to have yet yielded a solution. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what said solution is.
Well, I'm not a solutions person. I'm not utopian. I think that the problems of the world can be ameliorated by intelligent and thoughtful action, but the search for solutions or any kind of perfection is futile. One has to strike a balance, decide what one can achieve and wants to achieve, and if your aim in this is to prevent people dying from drugs, then it would seem to be the most sensible thing to do is to make sure as few people as possible take drugs. This used to be the view of the British government and its police and courts until really, and I recount all this in my book, The War We Never Fought, for anybody who wants the details, until a huge campaign was mounted in 68, 69 to effectively change the rules and soften the position on drugs, initially on marijuana, but later on this obviously spread to the other drugs. And since then, the amount of drug abuse in this country has hugely increased. And I think that there is, I can't establish this, but it seems to me to be very likely that this is because of the relaxation of the law. And people say to me, oh, well, prohibition never works, and so on and so forth. Well, US alcohol prohibition didn't work for many, many reasons, one of them being that it didn't at any stage make the possession of alcohol illegal. So the individual choice to whether to take the illegal drug was left entirely unpunished. As it is here, although technically people can be punished for possession of marijuana and other drugs, very few actually are. Wherever the law does take an attitude towards this, it tends to concentrate mainly upon supply and sales rather than on possession and use. And I think it's a grave mistake. I've got nothing against pursuing drug dealers, but it's futile to do so unless you pursue their customers as well. And people say, well, it never worked. It did work. In fact, it visibly worked in 1960s Britain when I was alive and conscious. But it also works in two other major free law-governed advanced countries, namely Japan and South Korea, which still prosecute possession of marijuana quite severely and have much lower levels of drug abuse. And I think if anybody was serious about this, then that's the line they would pursue. But it's difficult. It's politically difficult. It would be unpopular with a very vocal lobby. It would be unpopular with an extremely rich lobby, which is currently seeking to legalize marijuana for mass sale, advertising, and all kinds of other things, so that they can step into the void left by the discouragement of tobacco and cigarettes. So it would be tough, but it would be better. Almost all the discussion of this centers on what is called harm reduction, which tends to be the treatment of drug crimes as if they were, which are of course voluntary, as if they were a compulsory illness. So I think myself is an insult to the genuinely ill. If people could stop having cancer the way you can stop taking drugs, then I promise you they would do so. Whereas oddly enough, many people who take drugs don't stop doing so because they take drugs because they take pleasure in taking them. So I think there's a wholly misconceived attitude towards this, which is almost entirely taken over the academy and much of the media, and of course the world of politics. And most of what's talked about is drivel. That's why I wrote, in 2012 now, my book, as I say, The War We Never Fought, which became known in the publishing trade as the book they never bought, and indeed the book they never read. But I would commend it to anybody who wants to hear some intelligent, original, and informed thinking on this. If you want to do something about it that will make a difference and will actually save lives and prevent misery, then listen to me. But of course, I could say that till I went blue in the face, and it would make a difference. Once again, as we mentioned earlier, I'm right. They recognised it at the time, and it can make a difference.
Why do you think it seems to be Scotland is uniquely affected?
It isn't.
It's not?
Scotland has some pretty severe urban poverty and decay and all kinds of other things. So it has quite bad problems with other human failings, which are common in these circumstances, such as obesity and bad diet. But there are plenty of parts of England and Wales where there are similar levels of poverty and deprivation, and where similar things go on. But I would say here that I'm not saying that drug taking is purely an activity of the deprived and poor. Certainly in London, it's an activity of the well-off in very large numbers as well. And the conversion to drug taking of what you flatter them to call them, what you might describe as the intelligentsia during the 60s and 70s, means that there are very few people in any positions of prominence in British society now who haven't at some stage taken drugs. In many cases are embarrassed by it and don't want to be reminded of it, but in some cases they continue to do so. And in an alarming number of cases, they permit their children to do so in their homes with disastrous results. And that also has a great effect on the debate. People who are in that position, particularly in public life, don't want to say, I think we should be tough on drugs, because almost immediately out of their past will be dredged up. People will say, oh, so you're against drugs, are you? I remember you smoking dope from 1968. And so that inhibits an awful lot of people from speaking about it because of their own past. It's a form of corruption. That if people have done something wrong, they become reluctant to do anything about it. Of course, if they admitted what they'd done was wrong and were open about it, it would be easier for them to do that.
I think in the book as well you discuss this, but one thing that's always pointed to is, well, actually, Peter, you're wrong, because look at Portugal. You know, this is a model to emulate. Liberalisation, it clearly works, and drug consumption rooms are a clear evidence-based harm reduction intervention which allow people who use illicit drugs to do so within a medically supervised environment. So, Hitchens, you're wrong.
Well, I think people should look more carefully at Portugal. I mean, quite recently, the mayor of Porto, the second city of that country, urged a tightening of the laws because he didn't believe that what had happened would work. In some cases, Portuguese drug laws are more severe than those of Britain because, for instance, they can take away your passport or prevent you from following your trade or profession if they believe that you're being responsible with drug abuse, which no British court would dare to do. But under examination, I suppose advances and advantages of the Portuguese drug experiment turn out not to be quite so great as they seem. I have written a lengthy blog posting on the Peter Hitchens blog called The Portuguese Drug Paradise Examined, in which I go through quite a lot of both pro and anti accounts of what goes And I would say it's not as good as it's been made out to be. An American libertarian organization, the Cato Institute, began this whole frenzy about Portugal some years ago because they are great legalizers, and they portrayed it, as I say, as a paradise of relaxation. It simply isn't so. And the other thing you have to understand is that before the current laws of depenalization were introduced, Portugal had for a long time had a pretty relaxed drugs regime already. So it wasn't as if they suddenly went from being severely punitive to being extremely liberal. That very seldom happens. There's usually a long period of unenforced law before the law is abandoned. The same is true of the American states, such as Colorado, where marijuana has been effectively made legal. They had a long period before then when the law wasn't much enforced. So you don't get a jump in effect. So I advise people to examine all these things quite seriously and look into them in depth rather than falling for any claim that anywhere is perfect or has found a solution. And Portugal is certainly not a solution. But look it up, the Portuguese drug paradise on the Peter Hitchens blog. If you want, I tried to be as fair as I could. Obviously, there's no question I have a strong bias on the subject. So, but I don't, because of that, exclude evidence against me. It would be stupid. But take a look at it and see what you think. But it's not as good as it's claimed to be.
Now, I wonder if we might discuss unconscious bias training, because that's been scrapped for civil servants in England, with ministers saying it just doesn't work. And Liz Truss, you must have seen this, Peter, Liz Truss doing the rounds on Twitter and elsewhere with Conservatives saying, well, finally, the Conservative Party actually acts in a small c Conservative tradition. And the training, of course, intended to actually tackle patterns of discrimination and prejudice, is now used in many workplaces. But I wonder, Peter, if you have any thoughts with the government choosing to end what I would call quack training against the pressure of groups like Black Lives Matter, which have been incredibly powerful this year.
Daily Telegraph conservatism. People get excited about minor gestures.
Yes.
Politicians who call themselves conservatives, which appear to be conservative, but there are no true significance in the wider context of the way.
So you don't think that this is a meaningful step of clawing back our institutions?
It doesn't make any difference. The battle over the takeover of the new ideology was lost by the Conservative side many years ago, and is not going to be recovered. This country has now adopted as its official policy egalitarianism and what can loosely be described as political correctness. It's a phrase that I often say I loathe, but there's no substitute for it, as its official position. And the most interesting thing is going to be when, as must, alas, inevitably happen, we have another coronation. Just how different it is going to be from the extremely conservative Protestant ceremony which we had in 1953, which you can still read and watch. And that's the point at which anybody who hasn't noticed is going to have to understand just how much this country has changed inwardly. There's all kinds of outward things that remain more or less the same. They might still have a gold state coach and people in robes and coronets and so forth, but the inner nature of this country has been transformed permanently, in my view, for the worse. And that's happened. And to try and pretend that can be reversed by a gesture by Liz Truss, who, as far as I know, is a Liberal Democrat anyway, is how can I put this? Exaggerating a small thing into something important.
Well, I mean, when I hear you talk like that, I sort of, I feel nothing but dread. You know, that sort of. That,
so you should.
Yeah. But
we've had in this country a moral, social, and cultural revolution of enormous extent, and we are now, it seems to me, undergoing the political revolution which will cement it in place. The final stones are being slipped into the remaining gaps now, and it'll be wholly inescapable. And what goes next, and what is visibly disappearing now, is our liberty. Mm-hmm. And in whatever name it's destroyed, it is being destroyed, and it will not come back.
Well, we'll get on to that topic, but I wonder, Peter, then, I wonder if a lot of this, the topics we've discussed already, the drugs issue, the lack of, I guess, belief in conservatism that should anchor the Conservative Party, Big C Conservative Party.
I don't know why anybody would think that, honestly. And the Conservative Party's never been a politically conservative.
Yes. Well, should in if we were to actually reverse the tide in any meaningful way, that would be.
This is
Yeah.
spitting against the wind.
Yeah.
It happened.
Mm.
There was a time when I wrote my first book, The Abolition of Britain, in 1999. I wrote it in the hope, ludicrous as it now seems, of arousing opposition to developments which seemed to me to be highly dangerous. Nobody paid the slightest attention to that. It was mostly mocked as absurd. Then it continued to exist. It continues to be published as a description of events which were going on. Now it's become an obituary for a country which has ceased to exist. It still just about existed in 1999. It doesn't exist at all now. Even then, I hadn't fully grasped the extent of the Blair Project and what it would do. In 1999, it hadn't fully unfolded itself, but
sort of marched through the institutions.
By 2010, crowned by the Equality Act.
Yeah.
The legal and governmental structure of a wholly new society being put in place to match the cultural and moral and social changes which have been going on pretty intensively since the early 1960s.
Mm-hmm. Do you think explaining all of that then, and I'm thinking about your work, Rage Against God, and it's almost a pious followings behind the NHS, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, there are others, and I wonder if this is thanks to the God-shaped hole in society, and as far as, the drug problem, are we losing this societal shaming and respect for restraint and tolerance thanks to being a secular society?
Well, really, this all goes back to the 18th century and the growth in that period of political utopianism. The idea, as Tom Paine would put it, we can begin the world over again. And the idea first, as far as I know, set forward by Helvetius, that man could be altered, that human nature was not unalterable, which is necessarily an anti-Christian view, because the Christian view that man is made in the image of God states pretty strongly that man is not something which can be changed. And this is not an activity which should be pursued. But the French revolutionaries, to whose ideas the left are now returning after the long and failed diversion into Soviet communism, which they once supported, the French revolutionaries were all about beginning the world over again and reshaping man into a new creature. And although none of this works, and it will always end in tragedy, and utopia is always approached across a sea of blood, and you never get there, people still keep trying to go. Where at the moment we are going through a new utopian frenzy, the idea that the government can defeat a virus blown across the world by the wind. Similar to the idea that the government can cancel the seasons. It's as if I've said, it's at the moment the government's acting as if it could stop autumn by sending the army out to stick all the leaves back on the trees. These are not even sane actions, and they don't accord with any realistic understanding of how the world works. But we've almost become convinced in the past 9 months that the government can in some way abolish death, which it cannot do. But these fantasies of perfection grip humankind. They grip humankind very strongly because they channel benevolent emotions. The people who do these things don't say, I'm setting out to destroy freedom, or ultimately perhaps to lock up thousands of my opponents or even kill them. They say, what I'm doing is I'm making the world a better place. And my ideas are so good that you should jolly well obey them. And from then, it's just one step after another until eventually you reach the usual utopian horror.
Mm-hmm.
We're on that path now. The tickets to utopia are on sale again. You can't go to France, and you can't go to Germany, and you can't go anywhere. But you can book a ticket to utopia. You don't need a coronavirus test to go there.
And this sort of lurch to the pursuit of utopia, does that come from being a secular society? Do you think that is explained?
Well, Christianity has, and all religions fail in many ways because Christian churches are human organizations, and they're staffed and run by human persons who have terrible failings. And the churches become corrupt. Churches defend unspeakable practices and fail to set them right. And so the ideas on which they're based are condemned along with the organizations which pursue them. So the hatred, the anti-clerical hatred of 18th century France is not by any means entirely unjustified, any more than the rage against the Orthodox Church in Russia in 1917 had some reasons behind it, not because the religion had anything wrong with it, because the people who were in charge of it had behaved in ways which they probably shouldn't have done. But having thrown aside religion, we left in our minds an enormous gap with the human mind longs for goodness, it longs for kindness, and if it's deprived of the religious roots of that, it looks towards the political route. I would say that, in terms of politics, if only people had stuck to the formulae of late 19th century social democracy and its later rival in Europe, Christian democracy, is ameliorative movements trying to make things better, we'd have been okay. But people are impatient with these things, and they don't think they're enough, and they aren't good enough. They don't engage the deeper emotions enough. For that, you need something like Extinction Rebellion and the idea that the planet is in danger from man-made global warming, or an idea as big as that to engage the deep well springs of idealistic goodness which are to be found in most people.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting a little bit more personal for a second, I know from my own background, I've got two brothers, and they both think that my faith is absolutely insane. The worshipping of a sort of mystical pixie in the sky, but they're broadly sympathetic, I think, to cultural conservatism, as indeed many one-time Labour voters were, Peter, or are. But I wonder if, thinking about your brother, Christopher, I assume the same background as you, but you holding such vastly different public views on the issue of God and others. Did that teach you a thing or two about, I guess, tolerance and how to disagree better? Because that strikes me as one thing that society can't do today either. We simply can't disagree with each other. We either are guilty of, I don't know, gross mistruth, or we deserve to be hated because we are inherently evil for thinking differently.
There's a lot of that about. I've been having an argument on Twitter in the past couple of days with a person who keeps saying, well,
don't bother, Peter, don't bother.
No, it's necessary to hone the mind, and it's a public forum, and also for me, increasingly deprived as I am of broadcasting, Twitter is the only substitute which I have for that. I can't, and there are still a few small lighted spaces in the BBC where I can get on, but very few indeed, and the programs which used to welcome me and now don't invite me. There's a definite narrowing of the spectrum there. So I find Twitter a very good substitute for broadcasting. But this particular argument has a person who wanted to argue about the coronavirus. He started off by saying, basically, why are you so bad? Why don't you want to stop hundreds of thousands of people from dying by shutting down the country? And I said, well, shouldn't we start by asking you, since you're the one advocating strangling the economy and smashing up the NHS and destroying human liberty and forcing old people into suicidal loneliness, since you're in favour of all these measures, perhaps you'd care to give me the evidence on which your program is based. And he said, well, what about the evidence? Shouldn't you be producing evidence as to why we shouldn't be doing this? I said, well, no. If I watch a man who's got a wasp's nest in his house, trying to burn it down to get rid of the wasp nest, what is my duty? My duty is to stop him doing this mad thing. We can discuss other ways of dealing with wasps, such as, say, calling the council afterwards. But to begin with, I've got to stop him from doing it. And he hasn't got a justification for doing it. It's a mad thing to do. This is a mad thing to do. It's ridiculous and disproportionate. But it's impossible to argue with him because you simply can't grasp this point. You cannot grasp it. I have had a lot of practice. It's very useful having an adversarial family. Being forced to learn how to argue, but you also, if you engage in debate, then you very rapidly discover that the only satisfying way to argue is to listen to your opponents, to rebut them where you can, and to accept their points when they're good. And if you don't do that, then you don't really deserve to be in the game. It's like playing cricket without observing the rules. And of course, I benefited greatly from disagreeing with him. Disagreeing with somebody is one of the best ways of learning if, in the course of the disagreement, you're prepared to debate in a civilized fashion. And what I learned about that was, in fact, the claims that one could make, that the religious person could make, are extremely narrow, and are best expressed extremely narrow. What the point that I would ceaselessly make, to the disappointment I always thought of my atheist opponents, was, I'm not saying I know this. I'm not declaring that it's true. I'm saying I believe it. And I think fundamentally, it's a choice. And I choose it because of the kind of person I am and the sort of universe I hope to live in and hope indeed to die in. And it is a choice, and your choices are based upon your desires. And any expression of religious opinion is an expression of desire. I want this to be an ordered, purposeful universe in which I myself have a purpose. I don't want it to be an accidental cosmic car crash in which nothing matters. There is no justice. There is no order. There is no design, and in which none of my actions have any importance beyond their own measurable immediate effect. And the fascinating thing, which I can never ever get any atheist to engage with, is why do atheists so much want there not to be a God? Why do they want the universe to be a purposeless chaos? I think I know, because I used to be an atheist myself, but I'd like to hear their version. But they back away from it, saying it's not a choice. I can't possibly believe in God. There's no choice at all. The matter's closed. Can't do that. I know perfectly. I could be now an atheist if I chose to be one tomorrow. An atheist could choose to be a Christian if he wanted to tomorrow. It's a matter of choice. There is no binding, as there is, say, in the case of the theory of flight, or gravity, or several of the known chemical formulas. There is no knowledge you are compelled to accept as knowledge, as on the subject of whether there is or is not a God. There is no such knowledge. You're left with a choice.
And ultimately,
the only position you can take on the basis of what we know is agnosticism. If you want to be an atheist or a Christian or a believer, a theist of any kind, you have to jump. And you have to jump and say, this is what I believe, this is what I hope, not what I know.
Do you think that there's and I find this actually myself sometimes, I mean, I don't tweet or share posts about faith often, but when I was baptized and confirmed, I wrote a piece on this, and, you know, the sort of thing that you get is, oh dear, you're a God botherer, you're blah, blah, I can't believe you're so stupid, I thought better of you, blah, blah, blah. Not from anyone that you know personally, of course. But
that can happen.
That can happen, indeed.
That happened to me.
Yeah, well, I wonder if you can, first of all, explore that thought, but secondly, do you think the reticent nature of people to speak out, especially today, for fear of saying the wrong thing, for fear of being cancelled, does that feed into... Is there a bravery deficit in society, do you think? Or are people justified in keeping their cards close to their chest?
I mean, I am myself a state-registered coward. I don't have any physical courage, and largely since I had a quite bad motorbike accident many years ago, now more than 50 years ago, and experienced something most people haven't experienced, because they didn't quite pass out, which is very severe pain. You'd struggle to get me anywhere where any kind of major physical risk was involved. But people find courage when it really matters to them. It's given to you when you need it, I think. But you have to have a reason to have it. There's nothing new about this. I mean, it's in the Gospels. All men shall revile ye. This is not really expected, but actually taken as a sort of compliment and encouragement. If you're not being reviled, you're probably not doing the thing properly, and you mustn't be ashamed of what you believe. I have to not care. Or certainly I had to take it as a compliment when people behave in this way before me. It seems to me any serious believer in atheism has to understand that his belief is similar to mine. We've chosen what we want, and that there are atheists with whom one can have a serious conversation. But quite honestly, I'm bored by the subject. I don't ever have any intention of trying to persuade anybody with the rightness of my opinion. It's not for me to say. I don't go around telling people to believe anything that they don't want to believe, and I will not do that. Either people who don't believe in my religion, or people who don't believe in a religion at all, or people who have, as it were, theological differences even within my church. I will not enter into what I regard as sectarian disputes with them.
Yeah.
If people come and tell me, some members of the Roman Catholic Church sometimes go, "You ought to be a Catholic." Look, it's none of your business what I ought to be. You stick to your own last. It's really annoying going around telling people what they should believe, and I will not do it. And I'm very much against it.
Yeah, and so then I wonder. We hear a lot about how if the silent majority doesn't speak up, moving away from religion and back to politics, we hear a lot about how if the silent majority doesn't speak up, they will become the silenced majority. Now, you mentioned earlier about our liberties being stripped from us. I wonder if you any thoughts on that particular theme. Do you think people do need to start speaking up about a whole host of political issues, not just the way in which coronavirus is being used to justify the stripping of our freedoms and liberties?
Well, the silent majority never existed, and it was always a ludicrous concept. If it's silent, then it doesn't matter whether it's majority or not anyway. But I think what the use of the phrase silent majority was common in the period when the people whose opinions and morals were about to be overthrown didn't realize that this was about to happen, and were puzzled by the way in which the other side seemed to dominate everything, but they believed that they were still in the majority when they probably weren't. But they're very much like people who live in a house which is being eaten by termites, and until the last minute it still looks like a house, and then the termites eventually get the upper hand and the house collapses in a heap of dust, which is what happened to Christian Europe. Really, I think in the 1950s and 60s, finally it became, you looked at all the countries where you thought the Christian religion was strong, particularly the Roman Catholic countries such as Italy and Spain. In an amazingly short time, these countries were embracing mass divorce and abortion, and the church had become an increasingly impotent and the besieged institution. And because this didn't happen overnight, it had been happening for decades. But it finally reached the point. But in the intervening period, those who'd been used to a more or less Christian society thought, "What? There must be out there a silent majority that's not speaking." They were wrong. There was no such thing. There was a great deal of indifference, and a very, very. I keep having to say to people, you have to pay tribute to the cultural and moral left for the unbounded energy, determination, and grit which they've shown in changing the world. If Conservatives had 100th part of that, they wouldn't have lost so badly. But half their problem is that unlike me, they don't know what revolutionary socialism is like, or what revolutionary socialists are like, and they do not take seriously the danger which presents itself to them. A number of times I have republished a totally factual article about the Marxist influences on New Labour, and not even the influences, the fact that so many of its senior figures have Marxist pasts, which they have not, in my view, ever discerned, including Blair himself. And they say, "Oh, this is all Reds under the bed." It's not Reds under the bed stuff. There's nothing under the bed. This is open. This is what we know about. I suppose if you took all the cabinet ministers of the Blair era, I suppose about 1 in 10 of the major ones will turn out to have a Marxist past of one kind or another. I imagine there are many, many more of whom we know nothing. But the penetration of the British labour movement by various Marxist trends from the old Communist Party in the past to Trotskyists and similar things in recent years is so total. And yet Conservatives, and indeed many people in New Labour itself, have no idea what's going on. But I understand because I know the codes. I know the map references. I know what to look for. And I know I have an approximate idea of the history of thinking and the great switch which took place after 1968, away from class war, away from nationalisation and state control, and towards the cultural and moral and sexual sphere. That they simply don't grasp this, and I can't get it across to them. It's impossible to get people to understand, and that's another reason why I've given up politics. You cannot get the most absurd period was when the Tory party. The whole point of David Cameron was to actually turn the Tory party into a Blairite puppet, to Blairize the Conservative Party and remove all the remaining trappings of any sort of conservative belief from it. And the 2010 election was supposed to be an endorsement of that, which is why the BBC more or less backed Cameron in that 2010 election. And I could not get people in the years before 2010 to understand what was going on. And now they'll say, well, we should have listened to you. I said, of course you should have listened to me, but you didn't. And now you've got what you've got. And that's the opportunity to make real political change was thrown away for a stupid partisan victory, which actually enthroned your opponents.
Do you think a person is happier having left politics behind?
Well, if you had wanted, as I very much did, to influence events, and you had tried to do so using every ounce of your strength, whatever thy hand findeth to do it with thy might. And for many, many years before 2010, I've made it my business, because it seems to me the only path out of this was the destruction of the Conservative Party, and that it must lose the 2010 election. I spent so much time and made so many enemies calling for this. If at the end of all that you fail utterly, there is a moment of relief. I would compare it to, I'm bicycling frantically towards Paddington Station to catch the 5:50 train. And I know that when I get to the station, it's going to be a really marginal thing. I get there, I find a place to put the bike, lock the bike up, the lock will fall on the ground. Then the train won't be on the usual platform. I'll have to run. I'll climb aboard, maybe, if I'm lucky, in a sweaty mess. And then something happens on my ride, which means that I can't possibly catch the train, and I'll have to catch another one. And there's a huge amount of relief. I'm going to miss it because it's not my fault anymore. I'm not responsible for missing it because there's I don't know, whatever it is, the police would block the road and I have to go around the extra 10 minutes. I'm going to miss it. I'm relieved of responsibility at that point. And when it became clear to me that I was never going to get anybody to pay any attention to what I was saying, I decided that I would stop bothering. And it was a shrinking of the nature of my life. I had less to do and less to achieve and fewer ambitions. But it did make me less unhappy, yeah.
Do you think that what sort of effect did the accident that you mentioned on the motorcycle have upon you? Did that have a sort of profound effect on... Was the reason why you were so invested in trying to warn people of the ills of the path that we were headed on, by warning against a vote for Cameron in 2010, by warning that Marxists had infiltrated the Labour Party for years and years and years? Do you think that the accident profoundly moved you in any way to sort of see a value of life that others perhaps didn't? Because you see...
I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you picked up most... I've often mentioned this in books and articles and conversations, and hardly anybody ever picks up on it. So they're really... Perhaps it's because most people who I talk to have not experienced such a thing and don't know. It also makes travelling on any vehicle, on any road...
Terrifying.
Especially if the driver is in the slightest bit reckless, in my view, terrifying, because I know that in the course of 15 seconds, you can be moved from a world of apparent calm, safety, and normality into something of red, flaming screaming chaos. I know it's there, and I also have experienced the pain was just severe enough, was not quite severe enough to make me black out, and the damage was not good to look at. And I had to wait quite a while for the ambulance to come. There was actually less time than would have been normal at that stage, because the van into which I crashed my bike had a two-way radio, so they were able to call up an ambulance to the country road much quicker than otherwise would happen. Otherwise, I'd only have one leg. But it did, and the whole thing was transformative, as some things which happen to you are, in a way that I didn't realize at the time. Say more than 50 years ago now, I didn't realize at the time just how important it would be, but it keeps on coming back in various things. I know it influences me.
Yeah.
But if you have had that experience, I think it concentrates the mind wonderfully well to be in a position as I was for a very short time of thinking that I probably was going to die, and then being in considerable pain, and then having quite a few weeks of recovery.
So was it sort of moral? It gave you moral purpose, moral clarity.
Sorry, the other terrifying thing about it was that there was somebody else involved who, by enormous good providence, was not hurt at all, and I could have been responsible for serious injury or worse to somebody else, and that really haunts me.
And that must be surely why you become quite agitated by people driving recklessly, because you realise, one, it's not just yourself you're putting at risk, but you're actually putting another individual at risk as well. Well,
you know this. Everybody knows it's a matter of theory, but I think I feel I know it more deeply than most people do.
Yeah. Now, I wonder if we might spend the last few minutes just discussing the coronavirus. And I know you, as I said at the start, I owe you an apology, which I know you don't think is strictly necessary. But you have been absolutely right, Peter, and I think you've been completely vindicated.
But what kept you is the thing. If I knew how it could be done to get about 20 million other people to make the same transition as you've done, I'd be very pleased.
To know.
Well, I'd like to know how to do it, because I just don't.
I think with me it was
until we get a very, very sizable proportion of the population accepting this is all rubbish, then we're doomed. It will go on forever.
I think you're right, but also interestingly, though, I think that looking at the polling around Christmas, do you support? And this was before, of course, the government cancelled Christmas. Do you support the government's plans for bubbling over the Christmas holiday? And the public said no. Will you be bubbling over Christmas? And the public said yes. So it strikes me, Peter, that the public are saying, well, I want the government to be as strict.
Polls are funny things. They are, as I've often said, at least partly a device just for influencing opinion rather than measuring.
Yes.
And how you ask the question.
Exactly, and people thinking, well,
and also how you present the answers when you get them is the other key thing.
Yeah. It strikes me that people are actually a little bit wary about giving their true feelings about the matter. No?
You can push people by asking the questions in the right order and the right manner. You can push people into giving the answer you want them to give.
Yeah. I mean, what moved me was just watching, I've got, as I said earlier, I've got two siblings, both younger than me, both in and out of work, facing one of them just out of, finished his A-levels last year. And the way in which we're propelling people into financial and mental misery. And for what? It doesn't strike me that the lockdown is having any real impact.
Isn't it? I mean, if your country is threatened with an invasion by a foreign power which will subjugate you and march you off to slavery, then you will do all kinds of things to prevent this from happening. Many of them very expensive and costly in blood and treasure. But if you're faced with a disease which actually doesn't affect most of the population particularly seriously, is comparable to previous respiratory epidemics of the kind which have put pressure on the National Health Service, but not wholly intolerable pressure. And in any case, part of the reason for that pressure is the government's own decision over many years to cut down the number of beds in the National Health Service, so there are fewer emergency beds than there would once have been. That doesn't justify the things which we're doing. It doesn't begin to do so. And from the start, my argument has been the same. This is out of all proportion. That's, the government is like a mad surgeon. You go and see him because you have an ingrowing toenail. He says, right, well, I'm going to cut your leg off.
What do you think a proportionate response would look like?
You should run from the surgery.
Yes.
But people don't. They say, oh, okay, if you say so, doc, you cut it off. They get an ingrowing toenail on the other foot, and they go, and you say, well, they have to cut out the other one.
What would a proportionate response look like then? If Peter Hitchens was Prime Minister, what would a proportionate response be?
Well, I think the protection of the old is something which we failed at, obviously.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't reach for the tool of compulsion. I wouldn't shut down the economy. I'm much more saying things that I would not do. I would, doctors and hospitals are very good at treating people. That's what they're trained to do. And I would listen to them in terms of any kind of equipment or medicine or facilities they wanted to have. And the Nightingale hospitals don't seem to me to have been quite an achievement if that's what we needed. It turned out that even during the supposed height of the supposed first wave, and I use supposed because I'm very unsure about the true meaning of the statistics we've been given, the hospitals were never overwhelmed. Now, Fraser Nelson, the Spectator, has written a very interesting blog posting on this. He got hold of the figures are now public, which they don't give out at the time, and there simply was not an overwhelming of the hospitals. There were one or two where things got pretty tough, but because we have a national health service, that enables us to transfer either facilities or patients from one place to another. So there never was the overwhelming that was threatened. And then people will say, well, that was because we shut down. But I don't think there's ever been any evidence of that. The dates don't match it. We shut down on March 23rd. The peak of deaths was on April the 12th. And with an approximately 4-week gap between infection and death, that simply doesn't work. You can't say that a shutdown on March 23rd, even if it had been immediately effective, which it wasn't, could conceivably have produced a peaking in the disease 19 days later when it's roughly 4 weeks from infection to death. It just doesn't work. The thing is that the virus does what it does, more or less whatever we do. The lesson of Sweden, people say, oh, you're advocating the Swedish policy. Well, actually, I'm not. What I'm interested in with Sweden is what they didn't do. They didn't close down their economy.
Yeah.
They didn't close down most of their schools. They didn't force people to do things in the way when they introduced mass house arrest the way we did. And significantly, although their care homes went as badly wrong as ours did, that had nothing to do with any of those policies. If you cut out the care home deaths from the Swedish totals, then their outcomes are not significantly different from any other country. So, that's the point of Sweden, that they didn't do all these crazy things, and yet it didn't make any significantly worse than it would otherwise have been.
But a lot of people are suggesting now Sweden is having to put in place the sort of measures that we
there has always been a huge lobby in Sweden which wants these things to happen. But because of the unique independence of this table in Sweden, they haven't been able to do it because he didn't agree. But they carry on bashing away. But they haven't had to do it. There's been a lobby for it, which has become increasingly successful. And of course, every time that anything goes wrong in Sweden, people who've never reported a foreign country in their life suddenly descend and say, "Oh, look, Sweden! They're the ones who've been locked down. Now, look! They've got nearly as many deaths as we had when we locked down." Without thinking what they're saying, it doesn't. But what that says is that locking down, a hideous expression I try not to use, locking down doesn't actually make any difference. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. There is no, you go around the world, you look at all the countries, from Peru and Brazil to Belgium and Ireland and the Far Eastern countries, there is no congruence between the severity of shutdown and the number of deaths.
And so I was struck yesterday, it might have been the day before actually, I don't know if you saw this, but British Airways had offered Sir Captain Tom Moore, the guy who raised millions of quid for the NHS during the first lockdown and, was given a knighthood and all the rest of it, became a bit of a national treasure. And British Airways offered him a free flight to Barbados, and they took his family, who he lives with, over there as well. And now, Peter, I was struck by just how fast, and I was reading the quote tweets to a tweet that his family had posted from Barbados. 100 years old. And the tweet said, didn't he know that the NHS he was raising money for needs to be, I paraphrase, but needs to be protected? And I just thought, you would deny a man who's 100 years old from taking a holiday that's on his bucket list off of his list, that's been offered by a private commercial airline. It's extraordinary how fast people turn, isn't it?
Oh, yes. I think that is quite.
And I found it really quite depressing. Am I just naive? Is this the naivety of youth or what?
No, I think that one of the whole problems about public opinion is it's mob opinion, and mob opinion you can think you're leading a mob, and then suddenly find you're being chased by it, or you can be bathing in the approbation of the mob, and then suddenly you can find that they're howling for your doom. I don't like it. I'm not. I'm in favour of freedom, which is not to me necessarily synonymous with democracy. Democracy can be used to overthrow freedom. I used to be more inhibited about saying this, but I don't care now because I think one has to say it. The prime example of democracy being used to overthrow freedom was in Germany in 1933. Hitler came to power constitutionally, and as a result of elections. And the other example is President Erdogan in Turkey, who has used democratic methods to destroy Turkey's rule of law, its independent courts, its independent press, and has turned it into a semi-autocracy with him at the head of it. And that's been done democratically. Democracy by itself doesn't protect us at all. Societies need elites, they need restraints, they need laws which are enforced. And the great failure of the past 6-9 months now has been the failure of the courts to listen to attempts to get them to restrain the government from abusing its power.
Haven't you just made the case for the European Union?
But I don't quite see why.
As far as restraining the basically popular support and the majority,
well, no,
through technocratic means.
I know. I don't think I have, because I think that the only way in which a country can be effectively free is to be a country, to be a
nation, yeah,
a nation. And the European nation, the European Union is not a nation. It's supranational, and it prevents nations from existing as nations and takes away some of the most important characteristics. It eviscerates their constitution. So no, I wouldn't say that. I think the countries have to make these arrangements internally, particularly, say, by separation of powers, limitation of government,
yes,
and the absolute supremacy of the rule of law. But the rule of law can't be supreme if nobody will exercise it. And although very distinguished legal minds, such as Lord Sunshine, have pointed out that the use of the 1984 Public Health Act by the government to quarantine the healthy and introduce mass house arrest is almost certainly ultra vires, beyond the proper powers set out, and should not have been used for that purpose. The courts will not hear the case, although they were perfectly happy to hear Gina Miller's case. And actually, as it happens, I thought Gina Miller's first case on Henry VIII powers was absolutely right, and the judges should have upheld it. I didn't feel the same way about the prorogation, and I still don't. But nonetheless, the court should have heard the cases and did hear them, and that's the point. In the case of Simon Dolan's, because they have the whole battle that he's fought and lost over several months has been to get the courts to hear judicial review. They will not do it. They were right up to the point where the Supreme Court said, "We won't hear your appeal," against the High Court saying, "We won't hear it," and they just closed their minds and their doors. This is astonishing. So obviously a major issue of law that you'd think they'd be hungry for it.
Yes, I do agree with that.
You have to ask yourself why it is that the judiciary has been so feeble in this matter. I mean, you have to ask why supposedly independent media have been so feeble as well. That I think is a complicated matter to do with the wider effects of the Cultural Revolution. I think the left used to be a pretty reliable opponent of arbitrary power and a defender of liberty and freedom of speech. But that was because it was out of power itself. Now the left is increasingly in power, politically and culturally. It's less keen on freedom because that freedom is going to be used to criticize it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the real change that's happened. The courts are, people say it's a bizarre idea, the courts are full of conservative public school boys. The courts are not. The judiciary has been one of the most corrected and reformed parts of our system. And the courts don't particularly want to see challenges to the growing dominance of the left and its utopian projects, so they won't hear it. That's my guess.
Well, I've got two questions from that before I ask you to close by giving your predictions for 2021 and put you on the spot a little bit.
I wouldn't dare try.
I guess just whether or not you're optimistic or pessimistic then, and I assume it's the latter camp. But before we get on to that, the 2 points, the 2 questions I had from what you just said is, one, it does strike me that within the media and the so-called opposition, there is one direction, right? The clamour to lock down harder and faster, and not to ask whether or not, perhaps this is the wrong strategy that we're pursuing with this whack-a-mole lockdown strategy. The second question was, do you think Parliament it's been a dereliction of their duty to not force a recall to vote for example, the cancellation of Christmas? I mean, for goodness sake, to be able to do that by dictate is extraordinary.
Parliament can't call itself.
But to call on the
thing, I mean, it's grave to me, and I simply hadn't realised it because it hadn't been important until so recently. It's a grave gap in our law that Parliament has to rely on the government to call it into being. If it's not there, then, as far as I know, there's no mechanism by which Mr. Speaker can say, right, I'm going to call Parliament whether you like it or not. It ought to be, in my view. And so you can't blame Parliament for that.
Yes.
You can blame the government for waiting for Parliament to go on holiday before it took one of its most radical actions ever. Parliament has recovered a bit, and I think partly due to the actions of people like me, and the general sceptical movement has created in Parliament a small but definite opposition, which I hope will grow. To make up for the total absence of opposition from the official opposition, the Labour Party of Keir Starmer, another Trotskyist, is completely uninterested in opposing this, and whenever it says anything about it, all says, well, you haven't actually been stupid enough. Let's be more stupid. So he's no use, and his party's no use, but there are individual members in several parties who have begun to coalesce into an opposition, very late, but I hope not too late. And perhaps as this becomes more absurd and the sufferings of it, alas, become more intense, that opposition will become both more important and more powerful and more influential on events. But I don't know.
Mm. Well, then that final question. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to play Mystic Meg. Don't worry.
Well, I do it. I have no idea.
Yes, but I wonder then, are you? If we think about put it into context, so the fact that we are running at record levels of debt, over 2 trillion. This morning, those figures were released. The fact that, of course, there will be widespread unemployment, but that they argue, Peter, that the vaccine, much like a knight on a white horse, is coming galloping over the hill to rescue us from this strategy and from the restrictions on our freedoms and liberties. And so 2021 will be absolutely fantastic, and we've got absolutely nothing to worry about. I don't want you to make predictions, but then are you optimistic or pessimistic? Do you think that is utterly Panglossian or what?
I am. I'm a bit of a supporter of Dr. Pangloss, who's a very unfair caricature of Wilhelm Leibniz. But leaving that to one side, no, there is no reason to. The decision to declare the existence of the teenage mutant ninja virus was a decision to ramp up the panic again. And to ramp up the panic so that we could be plunged, as soon as Christmas is safely over, into yet another period of house imprisonment and economic strangulation, which the government apparently wants. What they didn't calculate on, because they are, as I keep pointing out, quite stupid, is that anybody outside this country would notice and say, oh, well, if they've got the Teenage Mutant Ninja virus, then we can't let anybody into our country from there in case we get it too. So they overplayed their hand to disastrous effect. And I don't know how easy it's going to be to unscramble that. The consequences simply for the flow of goods across the channel are, especially just as we're about to make that pretty bad anyway by leaving the single market. The consequences of that seems to me to be very hard to undo, and so we are in the hands of idiots, and it's suddenly better demonstrated. You have to have a health secretary because we've lost control. We've lost control of the virus. Well, it's not as if he ever had it. Advertised to the world that in the government's own opinion, they've lost control of the virus. So who's going to want to come here? Who's going to want to trade with us? Who's going to want to have anybody from here in their country? Well, nobody. If it's like that, then why would they? So they've just booed completely. They're not fit. They're not fit to run a parish council. They never have been. They haven't the intellect or the responsibility or the imagination or the wisdom or the knowledge or the education. They are useless beyond belief. But we currently have no way of getting rid of them lawfully.
Well, Peter Hitchens, I think that's a perfectly depressing way to end the show. Thank you very much for giving up your time today.
Depression is a much misused word. Depression is irrational grief. The grief and despair which people feel now is entirely irrational. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're watching things which they value being destroyed, and they're watching their future being mangled. And you'd have something wrong with you
to not be. Yeah.
If you were not grieved by that, that's not depression.
Yeah. Well, I stand corrected. You are, of course, right. As always.
Right.
Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell after that. Do let me know what you thought in the comment section, and I'll be posting more content this week, so please do consider checking that out too. Thank you very much.